The divorce papers crinkled against the wrapping paper as Eric slid them across our coffee table, right next to the twins' unopened presents. Christmas morning, 7:30 a.m., and this was my gift. But what he didn't know was that I had a present for him too, one that would change everything he thought he knew about our family. Let me back up, because this story doesn't start with betrayal on Christmas morning. It starts 3 years ago, with hope, desperation, and the kind of love that makes you blind to what's right in front of you. "You're overthinking this, Lily." Eric's voice carried that familiar edge of irritation as he scrolled through his phone at the breakfast table. I'd been explaining the IVF process for the third time, showing him pamphlets about donor selection, success rates, the emotional journey we were about to embark on together. Together. That word felt hollow even then, but I kept believing it meant something to him. The fertility clinic's waiting room had become my second home over those months. Sterile walls, motivational posters about miracles and new beginnings, and me, sitting alone appointment after appointment because Eric always had something more important. A work meeting, a golf game, a friend who needed help moving. Always something that mattered more than the family we were supposedly trying to build. "Mrs. Morrison, we'll need your husband here for the consultation about donor selection," Dr. Chen had said gently during our fourth appointment. "These decisions really should be made together." I'd nodded and promised Eric would be there next time, knowing even as I said it that I'd probably be sitting in that chair alone again, making choices that would shape our children's entire genetic makeup while their father was somewhere else, living his life like our infertility was my problem to solve. Before we continue, I want to thank you for joining me and sharing these stories that matter. If you believe that deception has consequences and that truth always finds a way to surface, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more people who need to hear this. Now, let's see how this Christmas morning unfolded. Eric did show up for exactly one appointment, the day we were supposed to finalize our donor selection. He sat in the leather chair next to mine, legs spread wide, checking his watch every few minutes like he was billing hourly for his time. Dr. Chen spread donor profiles across her desk like trading cards, each one representing someone's genetic legacy, someone's contribution to the children we hope to have. "This is weird," Eric muttered, barely glancing at the carefully anonymized profiles. Height, weight, education, medical history, even artistic abilities and personality traits all reduced to data points on crisp white paper. Can't we just pick one and move on? They're all the same anyway. They weren't all the same. Donor 2847 had a master's degree in literature and played classical piano. Donor 3291 was a marathon runner with a family history of longevity and no genetic predispositions to major diseases. Donor 4156 had written in his personal statement about wanting to help couples build families, about understanding that genetics were just the beginning of what made someone a parent. I'd spent weeks researching, reading every profile dozens of times, imagining what traits might bloom in our children, what gifts they might inherit from these generous strangers. Eric spent 15 minutes flipping through them like he was choosing a restaurant for lunch. He said, "This one looks fine." He tapped donor 2291's file without really reading it. "Athletic, good health, whatever. Can we go now? I've got a conference call at 2. That should have been my first clue. Not just that he was rushing through the most important decision we'd ever make together, but that he was already checking out of the process entirely. In his mind, his part was done. Show up, point at a file, let science and his wife handle the rest. The IVF process is brutal in ways no one prepares you for. The hormones that make you feel like you're losing your mind, the daily injections that leave you bruised and tender, the constant monitoring and hoping and waiting. Eric's contribution was a single clinic visit and then nothing. While I was giving myself shots twice a day and tracking every symptom, every change, every flicker of hope or despair, he was living like nothing had changed. "How are you feeling today?" he'd ask sometimes, the question automatic and empty, like asking about the weather. He never waited for a real answer. If I started to explain the exhaustion, the emotional roller coaster, the way my body felt like it belonged to someone else, his eyes would glaze over and he'd find something urgent to do in another room. The day we found out I was pregnant, I called him at work, my hands shaking as I stared at the positive test. 2 pink lines after months of hoping and disappointment and putting my body through hell. "That's great, babe," he said, but I could hear typing in the background. "Listen, I'm in the middle of something. We'll celebrate tonight, okay?" We didn't celebrate. He came home, said congratulations, and asked what was for dinner. Like I told him I'd finally finished that book I'd been reading. Not that we were having the babies we'd dreamed about for years. When we found out it was twins, his reaction was even more telling. Not joy, not excitement, not even appropriate concern about the increased risks and complications. Just a heavy sigh and a comment about college tuition costs. 2 babies, 2 lives we'd fought so hard to create, and all he could think about was money. The pregnancy was complicated from the start. Bed rest at 28 weeks, regular monitoring, constant worry about early labor, and all the things that could go wrong with multiples. Eric's response was to act inconvenienced by my inability to keep up with household tasks. I was literally growing our children, risking my health to bring them safely into the world, and he was annoyed that dinner wasn't on the table when he got home. "I know you're tired," he'd say when I asked for help with basic things like grocery shopping or cleaning, "but I'm working extra hours to prepare for the medical bills. We can't both be useless right now." Useless. That's what he called me while I was on bed rest, following doctor's orders to keep our babies safe. Useless while my body was performing literal miracles, creating 2 perfect human beings from hope and science and sheer determination. Lily and Jake were born on a Tuesday morning in March, 6 weeks early but healthy and strong. The moment I held them, felt their tiny fingers curl around my own, I understood love in a way I'd never experienced before. Pure, protective, fierce love that would reshape every priority I'd ever had. Eric held them too, briefly, for photos his mother insisted on taking. But even in those first precious moments, I could see the disconnect in his eyes. He was going through the motions of new fatherhood, saying the right words, making the appropriate faces, but there was no transformation happening, no sudden realization that everything had changed, that we were responsible for these perfect little souls who depended on us completely. The first few months were a blur of sleepless nights, endless feedings, and the overwhelming logistics of caring for 2 infants. I'd expected Eric to step up, to become the partner and father our family needed. Instead, he seemed to view the babies as particularly demanding roommates who'd moved in without permission. "They're so loud," he'd complained when their crying woke him at night, as if newborns should somehow understand his need for uninterrupted sleep. He'd put on headphones or sleep in the guest room, leaving me to handle night feedings and diaper changes alone. During the day, he'd hold one of them occasionally, usually when his mother was visiting and watching, but hand them back the moment they got fussy or needed anything beyond basic cuddling. "You're so much better at this than me," he'd say when I'd ask him to help with feeding or bathing. "They prefer you anyway. It's that mother's intuition thing." If it wasn't intuition, it was showing up, learning through trial and error, being present for the difficult moments as well as the sweet ones. It was choosing to be a parent instead of a babysitter in your own home. As the twins grew from infants to toddlers, Eric's disengagement became even more obvious. He'd come home from work and go straight to his computer or the television, barely acknowledging Lily and Jake's excited attempts to get his attention. When they'd run to him with drawings they'd made or toys they wanted to share, he'd give them distracted pats on the head and vague, "That's nice," responses without even looking at what they were showing him. I watched my children learn to stop trying to connect with their father. Watched their initial excitement when he walked through the door gradually fade into polite acknowledgement. They stopped bringing him their pictures, stopped asking him to read bedtime stories, stopped expecting him to be present for the moments that mattered to them. "Daddy's busy" became my constant refrain, protecting them from the reality that their father simply wasn't interested in being their father. I made excuses for missed school events, forgotten promises, the way he'd zone out completely when they tried to tell him about their day. I was raising twins and managing a marriage that felt more like a careful diplomatic arrangement than a partnership. The breaking point came last spring during Jake's first t-ball game. I'd mentioned it to Eric dozens of times, marked it on our family calendar, sent him reminder texts. The whole team's families would be there, and Jake had been practicing his swing in the backyard for weeks. So proud of his new uniform, so excited to show Daddy what he'd learned. Eric showed up 40 minutes late, still in his work clothes, talking loudly on his phone about some client issue. Jake's face lit up when he spotted his father in the stands, and he waved enthusiastically from the field. Eric gave him a brief wave back without interrupting his phone conversation. He stayed for 15 minutes, never once watching Jake actually play, and left before the game ended because he had dinner plans with colleagues. That night, after I'd put the twins to bed and listened to Jake ask why Daddy had to leave early, I found Eric in the living room scrolling through his phone like nothing had happened. "Jake was really disappointed you left," I said as I sat on the edge of the couch. "I was there," Eric replied without looking up. "I showed up, didn't I? These client dinners are important, Lily. Someone has to think about our financial future." Our financial future. As if loving his children and being present for their childhood was somehow irresponsible, somehow incompatible with providing for the family. As if he was the only one making sacrifices, the only one thinking ahead, the only one whose time and energy mattered. "He's 4 years old," I said quietly. "He doesn't understand about client dinners. He just knows his dad didn't want to watch him play." Eric finally looked at me, his expression impatient and slightly annoyed. "You're being dramatic. Kids don't remember this stuff anyway. He'll be fine." But Jake did remember. They both did. Children notice everything, absorb every interaction, internalize every message they receive about their worth and importance in their parents' lives. Eric was teaching our children that they were interruptions, inconveniences, secondary priorities in his carefully ordered world. I started documenting things differently after that night. Not consciously at first, but I found myself paying closer attention to Eric's interactions with the twins, his responses to their needs, his level of engagement with their lives. The pattern was undeniable and heartbreaking. He was a father in name only, going through minimal motions when absolutely necessary, but never truly investing in the relationship. School events he missed because of work. Birthday parties he attended but spent on his phone. Bedtime stories he was always too tired to read. Soccer practices he never volunteered to help with. Parent-teacher conferences he sent me to alone. Every missed moment, every half-hearted interaction, every time he chose something else over his children, I started to see clearly. The children noticed too. Lily started asking why other daddies helped coach their kids' teams and played at the playground and seemed happy to be there. Jake stopped talking about Daddy at school, according to his teacher who mentioned it during one of those conferences Eric had skipped. They were learning to expect nothing from him, to find their emotional support and encouragement entirely from me. The revelation about the donor selection came by accident in a way that made me question everything I'd believed about our family's foundation. I was organizing our filing cabinet last summer, trying to create a system for the twins' medical records, school forms, and the endless paperwork that comes with raising children. In the back of Eric's desk drawer, I found the IVF clinic folder I'd assumed he'd thrown away years ago. The donor profiles were still there, along with all the forms and information packets Dr. Chen had given us. But as I flipped through them, something caught my attention. Donor 3291, the profile Eric had hastily selected that day, had notes written in the margins in my handwriting. Not his. Mine. I remembered that appointment differently than what the evidence was showing me. Eric had pointed to a file, yes, but when I really thought about it, really forced myself to remember clearly, he'd pointed to donor 2847, the literature professor with the piano background. I'd been the one to switch to 3291, the athlete with the strong family health history, because I'd done the research and knew what traits I wanted our children to potentially inherit. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Eric hadn't chosen the donor genetics for our children. He'd made a careless, impatient gesture toward a random file, and I'd made the actual decision. The twins' genetic makeup, their inherited traits, their entire biological foundation had been my choice entirely. Eric had contributed nothing to the selection process except annoyance and a desire to leave as quickly as possible. But there was more. The donor information forms had details I'd forgotten, specifics about background and family history that became relevant as I watched Willie and Jake grow into their own personalities. Donor 3291 had noted artistic tendencies in his family, musical ability, and academic achievement. Lily had started showing remarkable aptitude for drawing and music. Jake was already reading at a level far above his peers and showed the kind of focus and determination that reminded me of the donor's personal statement about marathon running and goal achievement. Our children were becoming themselves, developing talents and interests and ways of being in the world that had nothing to do with Eric and everything to do with carefully chosen genetics and the environment I'd created for them. Their father's contribution had been minimal from the very beginning, even before they were born. That night, I lay in bed next to my husband and felt like I was living with a stranger, not because he'd changed, but because I was finally seeing him clearly. Eric had never wanted to be a father. He'd wanted the idea of family, the social acceptability of marriage and children, the appearance of a successful life. But the actual work of parenting, the emotional investment, the daily choice to put his children's needs alongside his own, had never interested him. I started paying attention to other families, watching how involved fathers interacted with their children, how they balanced work and family responsibilities, how they talked about their kids. The contrast was stark and painful. I watched dads at the playground actually playing with their children instead of sitting on benches checking email. I saw fathers at school pickup who knew their kids' teachers' names, who asked about homework and friends and daily struggles. Eric knew almost nothing about our children's inner lives. He couldn't tell you Lily's favorite book or Jake's best friend's name. He didn't know about Jake's fear of thunderstorms or Lily's obsession with butterflies. He was living in the same house with two fascinating, complex little human beings and remained essentially a stranger to them. The decision to investigate our options came gradually, through conversations with other mothers who'd faced similar situations, through late-night internet research, through careful consultations with family lawyers who specialized in cases involving assisted reproduction. The legal landscape around IVF and donor genetics was complex, but certain facts emerged clearly. Eric had no biological connection to Lily and Jake. None. The sperm that had created them came from donor 3291, a man whose genetic material I had selected based on extensive research and careful consideration. Eric's role in their conception had been entirely legal and social, not biological. In the eyes of the law, he was their father because he was married to me and had consented to the IVF process. But that legal relationship was contingent on continued marriage and could be modified under certain circumstances. More importantly, there were precedents for situations where non-biological fathers had sought to terminate parental responsibilities, especially in cases where the relationship with the birth mother had deteriorated. Eric, if he chose to, could walk away from Lily and Jake with minimal legal or financial obligation, but the reverse was also true. If he was determined to be an unfit or unwilling parent, his rights could be limited regardless of the original legal arrangement. I wasn't planning anything dramatic initially. I was just gathering information, understanding our situation, preparing for possibilities I hoped would never become reality. but I was also documenting Eric's lack of engagement, his minimal participation in the children's lives, his clear preference for his own interests over his family's needs. The documentation process was both heartbreaking and revealing. I started keeping a simple log of Eric's interactions with the twins, how often he initiated conversation with them, whether he attended their school events, how he responded when they asked him for help or attention. The pattern that emerged was devastating and undeniable. In an average week, Eric spent less than 30 minutes in meaningful interaction with his children. He'd eat dinner with us most nights, but he'd be on his phone or distracted by work concerns. He'd say goodnight to them when I reminded him, but he rarely initiated bedtime routines or spent time in their rooms talking about their day. Weekends were slightly better, but only because I'd explicitly ask him to take them to the park or include them in errands. When Lily started taking piano lessons, something that connected directly to the musical genetics I'd selected from donor 3291, Eric never once asked to hear her practice or attended any of her recitals. When Jake joined the school's reading club and started devouring chapter books, Eric didn't know about his achievement until his teacher mentioned it at a chance encounter in the grocery store. The children's reactions to their father's disengagement were the most painful thing to document. They'd stopped asking him to help with projects or homework because they'd learned he'd always redirect them to me. They'd stopped inviting him to play games because he'd always say he was too busy. They'd started planning their days around his absence, unconsciously organizing their activities and conversations for when mommy was available. I was essentially a single parent living with a man who happened to share our address and financial obligations. Eric provided for us financially, yes, but his emotional and practical contribution to raising Lily and Jake was minimal to non-existent. If he disappeared tomorrow, the children's daily routines, emotional support, and care would remain virtually unchanged. That realization was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it meant I was already successfully managing everything that mattered in their lives. Terrifying because it meant the man I'd married, the father of my children, had never really been present for any of it. The conversation about Eric's priorities came to a head 3 months ago during Lily's school fall festival. She'd been chosen to perform a piano piece she'd been practicing for weeks, a simple but beautiful melody that showcased the musical ability that seemed to be emerging naturally from her carefully selected genetic heritage. She was so proud, so excited to show both her parents what she'd learned. Eric had promised to be there, promised Lily specifically, looking her in the eye and telling her he wouldn't miss it. She'd talked about it for days, practicing extra hard, planning what she'd wear, imagining Daddy's proud face in the audience. The festival was scheduled for Thursday evening at 7. I took the afternoon off work to help Lily get ready, to braid her hair the special way she'd requested, to make sure she felt confident and prepared. At 6:30, as we were getting ready to leave, Eric called. "I'm not going to make it," he said without preamble. "Peterson client is in town unexpectedly, wants to have dinner to discuss the contract. This could be huge for us, Lily. Lily will understand." Lily, who was standing next to me in her carefully chosen dress, her hair perfectly braided, her sheet music clutched in her small hands, heard every word. I watched her face change from excitement to confusion to that carefully blank expression children develop when they're trying not to cry in front of adults. "Daddy can't come?" she asked quietly.
I wanted to lie, to make an excuse that would preserve her excitement and protect her from the reality of her father's priorities. Instead, I found myself telling her something closer to the truth. "Daddy has a work meeting that he thinks is more important than your performance." Eric heard me through the phone. "That's not fair, Lily. You know I'd be there if I could. Business is business." "She's 4 years old. She won't even remember this next week." But she would remember. She'd remember the way her excitement deflated, the way she had to be brave and perform her beautiful piano piece while scanning the audience for a father who'd chosen a business dinner over her proud moment. She'd remember that her daddy's work was more important than her accomplishments, her feelings, her belief that she mattered to him. That night, After Lily's flawless performance and the reception where other fathers congratulated their children and took pictures and made their kids feel celebrated, I put the twins to bed and made a decision. Not a dramatic one, not motivated by anger or revenge, but a calm, clear-eyed decision about what my children deserved and what I was willing to accept. I called the family lawyer I'd consulted months earlier and scheduled a comprehensive appointment to discuss our options, not for immediate action, but for understanding, for preparation, for ensuring that if Eric continued to demonstrate that he'd rather be a part-time father and full-time husband when it was convenient for him, I'd be ready to make choices that protected Lily and Jake's emotional well-being. The legal consultation was enlightening in ways I hadn't expected. Family law around assisted reproduction was designed to protect children's interests above all else, but it also recognized the reality that biological and social parenthood didn't always align. Eric's legal rights as the twins' father were based on his marriage to me and his consent to the IVF process. But those rights came with corresponding responsibilities that he could be held accountable for. More relevantly, there were provisions for modifying custody and parental rights in cases where one parent had essentially abandoned their parental responsibilities, while remaining technically present. Eric's pattern of minimal engagement, missed events, and emotional unavailability could be documented and presented as evidence that he'd voluntarily reduced his role in the children's lives. The lawyer also explained something I hadn't considered. If Eric wanted to end our marriage, his obligations to Lily and Jake would depend on whether he chose to maintain his parental rights or relinquish them. Since he had no biological connection to them, and since the donor sperm had been my selection entirely, he could potentially walk away with minimal ongoing responsibility if he chose to. That possibility should have been devastating, but instead it felt oddly freeing. If Eric wanted out of our marriage, if he decided that being a husband and father was too much work or too restricting for the life he wanted to live, then maybe the best thing for all of us would be an honest acknowledgement of what our family had really become. I wasn't plotting revenge or planning to hurt Eric. I was simply preparing for honesty. If he wanted to leave, if he decided that his work and his freedom were more important than his family, then I wanted him to understand exactly what he'd be leaving behind and exactly what his legal relationship to our children would become. The documentation continued through the fall. Missed parent-teacher conferences that I attended alone, Halloween costume shopping that he couldn't be bothered with, birthday party planning for the twins' 5th birthday that he left entirely to me while traveling for business he'd scheduled during their birthday week without consulting our family calendar.
Each missed moment, each absent gesture, each time he chose something else over his children, I recorded carefully and objectively. Not to build a case against him, but to build a clear picture of what our marriage and his fatherhood actually looked like when stripped of excuses and optimistic interpretations. By December, I realized that Eric's engagement with our family had become almost entirely performative. He'd show up for events when his mother was visiting because she'd ask pointed questions about his absence. He'd participate in family activities when we were around other couples because anything else would invite commentary about his priorities. But in the daily reality of our home life, he was essentially a roommate who contributed financially and expected meals and clean laundry in return. The children had adapted to his emotional absence in ways that broke my heart. They'd learned to include him politely in conversations without expecting real engagement. They'd stopped asking him for help with projects or homework because they knew he'd redirect them to me. They'd unconsciously organized their lives around his unavailability, planning their activities and emotional needs for times when I was accessible. Lily, with her inherited musical ability and sensitive nature, had become almost protective of my feelings, seeming to understand that Daddy's disinterest hurt me as much as it confused her.
Jake, showing the determination and focus that reminded me so much of Donor 3291's personal statement, had developed a fierce independence that didn't require anything from his father. They were thriving despite Eric's minimal involvement, not because of it. Their confidence, their curiosity, their emotional development, their sense of security and worth all came from the environment I'd created for them and the careful attention I paid to their needs and interests. Eric was a peripheral figure in their emotional lives, present physically but absent in every way that mattered. The Christmas Eve conversation happened by accident, during one of Eric's rare attempts at parental engagement. The twins were in bed, and he was helping me wrap presents in the living room. Something about the domestic normalcy of the moment, the illusion of partnership, made me nostalgic for the marriage I'd thought we were building. "They're amazing kids," I said, folding tissue paper around Lily's new art supplies. "I love watching their personalities develop, seeing what they're naturally drawn to." Eric looked up from the tablet he was wrapping for Jake. "They're good kids. Easy kids, really. Not like some of the nightmare children you hear about. Easy kids, as if their emotional intelligence, their creativity, their curious natures were conveniences for him, rather than remarkable qualities that deserved nurturing and celebration. As if their bridness was something that just happened naturally, rather than the result of careful parenting, consistent attention, and deliberate choices about their environment and experiences." "Do you ever think about the donor selection?" I asked, testing waters I wasn't sure I wanted to wade into. "Whether we chose well, whether the twins got good genetic foundations?" He shrugged, not really listening. "I guess so. They seem normal enough. Smart, healthy, no obvious problems. Can't really tell what comes from genetics versus environment anyway." But I could tell. Lily's musical aptitude was clearly genetic, emerging naturally without any family history from Eric's side or mine. Jake's academic abilities and focus were far beyond what either of us had shown as children. Their physical coordination, their immune systems, their energy levels, even their sleep patterns all reflected the careful research I'd done into Donor 3291's background and family history. "Do you remember much about the donor we chose?" I asked, genuinely curious about what Eric retained from that process we'd supposedly gone through together. "Not really," he admitted, his attention already shifting back to his phone. "Some athletic guy. Right? College educated?" They were all pretty similar. Does it matter now? It mattered because those genetics were shaping our children's potential, their natural abilities, their health and temperament. It mattered because I'd spent weeks researching and considering options while Eric had barely glanced at the profiles. It mattered because the donor I'd selected was proving to be exactly the kind of genetic foundation I'd hoped for our children. But Eric's casual dismissal of something so fundamental to our children's biology revealed everything about his approach to parenthood. He'd never been invested in any aspect of creating our family, from conception through daily care. He'd gone through the motions when necessary and left the real work of loving and raising Lily and Jake entirely to me. That night, lying next to him in our bed, I realized that our marriage had become an elaborate fiction we were both pretending to believe. Eric was pretending to be a devoted husband and father while living primarily for himself. I was pretending that his minimal contributions were enough, that his emotional absence was just his personality, that the children didn't notice or need more from him. But the children did notice. They'd learned to expect nothing from their father and everything from me. They'd adapted to his unavailability by becoming self-sufficient in ways that 4-year-olds shouldn't have to be. They'd unconsciously protected themselves from disappointment by not counting on him for anything beyond basic physical presence. The Christmas morning reveal wasn't planned as revenge or punishment. It was planned as honesty. If Eric wanted to end our marriage, if he'd decided that being a husband and father was too restricting for the life he wanted to live, then he should understand exactly what he was walking away from and exactly what his legal and biological relationship to our children actually was. Christmas morning arrived with the kind of crisp winter perfection that makes everything feel possible. Snow had fallen overnight, blanketing our neighborhood in pristine white that reflected the early morning sun. Lily and Jake woke up before dawn, as children do on Christmas, vibrating with excitement about presents and the magic of the day. Eric was already awake when I got up, sitting in the kitchen with his coffee and his phone, scrolling through work emails like it was any other Tuesday. Even on Christmas morning, the day our children had been anticipating for weeks, he couldn't disconnect from work long enough to be fully present. "The kids are awake," I said, starting coffee for myself and listening to their excited whispers from upstairs. "I heard them," Eric replied without looking up. "Give me a few minutes to finish this email, then we can do presents." A few minutes to finish an email on Christmas morning? While our 4-year-old twins waited upstairs, practically vibrating with anticipation, their father was prioritizing whatever work crisis couldn't wait until after the holiday. Even on the one day of the year that's supposed to belong entirely to family and wonder and childhood joy. I brought Lily and Jake downstairs, their faces glowing with Christmas morning magic, their pajamas rumpled from sleep and excitement. They ran to the tree, marveling at the presents that had appeared overnight, pointing out packages with their names, whispering guesses about what might be inside each carefully wrapped box. Eric finished his email and joined us in the living room, carrying a manila envelope that looked distinctly non-festive among the bright wrapping paper and ribbons. He set it on the coffee table next to the twins' presents, his expression unreadable but determined.
"Before we do presents," he said, his voice carrying a formality that made my stomach clench, "there's something we need to discuss." Lily and Jake looked between us, their Christmas excitement dimming slightly as they sensed the adult tension creeping into their magical morning. I moved closer to them instinctively, creating a protective barrier between their joy and whatever Eric was about to destroy. "On Christmas morning?" I asked, quietly, glancing at our children's confused faces. "It's time, Lily," Eric said, sliding the envelope across the coffee table toward me. "I've been thinking about this for months. We both know this isn't working anymore." The envelope was thick, official-looking, with the letterhead of a law firm I didn't recognize. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, though I wasn't surprised by what I found inside. Divorce papers, already signed by Eric, dated December 20th. He'd been planning this Christmas morning ambush for 5 days, sitting through family dinners and bedtime stories and present wrapping sessions while knowing he intended to blow up our children's world on their favorite day of the year. "You're divorcing me on Christmas morning?" I said, my voice steady despite the surreal horror of the moment. "In front of the children?" Lily and Jake were watching us with the kind of wide-eyed stillness that children develop when they sense their world shifting beneath them. They didn't understand the legal terminology or the implications of the papers in my hands, but they understood enough to know that something terrible was happening to their family. "I want to be honest with them," Eric said, though nothing about his timing or approach suggested honesty was his primary motivation. "I want them to understand that sometimes adults make difficult decisions, but it doesn't mean we don't love them." Love them. The man who'd missed more school events than he'd attended, who'd never once read them a bedtime story without being explicitly asked, who'd spent Christmas Eve finishing work emails instead of enjoying their excitement about Santa's visit, was talking about love. "You're right," I said, carefully folding the divorce papers and setting them aside. I reached for my purse, which I had deliberately placed next to the couch the night before, and pulled out a red folder that matched the one I had been carrying for weeks. The folder that contained the real story of our family's foundation, the true nature of Eric's relationship to our children, and the legal documentation that would reshape everything he thought he knew about his rights and responsibilities. "Before you celebrate your freedom," I said, sliding the red folder across the coffee table, "there's something you should understand about what you're walking away from."
Eric's confident expression faltered slightly as he reached for the folder. The children were still watching, still confused, but I could see Lily's sharp intelligence working to piece together the tension in the room. Jake, with his inherited determination and focus, was studying his father's face with unusual intensity. The first document in the folder was the donor selection paperwork from our IVF clinic, with detailed notes in my handwriting about the research I'd done, the comparisons I'd made, the careful consideration I'd given to choosing donor 3291's genetics for our children. Eric's contribution to the selection process was documented as well, a hasty gesture toward a random file, and a complaint about being late for a conference call. Beneath that were the donor's comprehensive medical records, family history, educational background, and personal statement. The genetic foundation I'd selected for Lily and Jake was laid out in clinical detail, showing exactly where their musical ability, their academic aptitude, their physical coordination, and their temperament had originated. None of it came from Eric.
The legal documents were next. Consultation notes from family lawyers explaining the relationship between biological and social parenthood in assisted reproduction cases. Precedents for custody modification when parents had minimal involvement in their children's lives. Documentation of Eric's pattern of absence and disengagement over the past 2 years. But the most significant document was at the bottom of the folder. A legal memo outlining Eric's actual rights and obligations regarding Lily and Jake, both within our marriage and in the event of divorce. Since he had no biological connection to them, and since his parental rights were based entirely on his marriage to me and his consent to the IVF process, his legal relationship to our children was more tenuous than he'd ever understood. Eric's face went through a fascinating progression as he read through the folder. Confusion as he tried to understand why I had all this documentation. Recognition as he began to remember details about the donor selection process that he'd barely paid attention to at the time. Disbelief as he read the legal implications of his non-biological relationship to the twins. And finally, fear. Real, bone-deep fear as he began to understand that the man who'd planned to walk away from his family with minimal consequences had just discovered that his assumptions about his rights and leverage were completely wrong. "What is this?" he asked, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "It's the truth about our family that you never bothered to learn," I said calmly, aware that Lily and Jake were still listening, still trying to understand why Christmas morning had become something dark and complicated. "The truth about who chose the genetics that created our children. The truth about your actual relationship to them, both biological and legal." Eric flipped through the documents again, this time reading more carefully, his face growing paler as the implications became clear. The donor selection had been entirely my decision, based on weeks of research he'd never participated in. The genetic traits emerging in Lily and Jake came from a stranger whose profile I'd studied carefully while Eric had barely glanced at the paperwork. More importantly, his legal rights as their father were contingent on his continued marriage to me and his demonstrated commitment to parenting them. The documented pattern of his absence, his minimal engagement, his consistent prioritization of work over family, could be presented as evidence that he'd already effectively abandoned his parental responsibilities. "You've been building a case against me," he said, his voice tight with a mixture of anger and panic. "I've been documenting reality, your choices, your priorities, your level of engagement with our children. If you see that as a case against you, maybe that tells you something about the kind of father you've been." Lily had moved closer to me during this exchange, her small hand finding mine, her intuitive understanding that whatever was happening between her parents, she was safer on my side of it. Jake remained where he was, but his attention was entirely focused on his father's face, watching Eric's reaction with the kind of intensity that suggested he was learning something important about the man he'd been trying so hard to impress. "What is this? So what? You think you can use this to keep me from the kids? You think you can punish me for wanting out of a marriage that isn't working?" "I think," I said carefully, keeping my voice calm for the children's sake, "that
You should understand what you're actually walking away from before you make your final decision. And I think you should understand what your legal obligations will look like if you choose to abandon the children you helped create through IVF. The word abandon hit him visibly, because that's what he'd been planning to do, wasn't it? Not just end our marriage, but extract himself from the daily reality of parenthood that had never really interested him. The divorce papers he'd prepared were designed to give him minimal custody, minimal financial responsibility, maximum freedom to live the unencumbered life he'd apparently been longing for. "I'm not abandoning anyone," Eric said, but his protest sounded hollow even to him. "I'll still be their father. I'll still see them." "When?" I asked simply. "You barely see them now, and we live in the same house. You've missed more of their events than you've attended. You don't know their teachers' names, their friends, their fears, their dreams. In what way are you planning to be their father that's different from how you've been their father for the past 4 years?" The silence that followed was devastating, because Eric couldn't answer that question honestly, without admitting that he'd never really been present for Lily and Jake, that his vision of post-divorce fatherhood was probably even more minimal than his current level of engagement. Lily tugged on my hand, her voice small and confused. "Mommy, are we not going to open presents?" The question broke my heart and refocused my priorities instantly. Whatever Eric had planned for this morning, whatever dramatic confrontation he'd envisioned, my children didn't deserve to have their Christmas destroyed by adult failures and legal complications. "Of course we're going to open presents, sweetheart," I said, kneeling down to her level and smoothing her hair. "Daddy and I just need to finish talking about some grown-up things, and then we'll have our Christmas morning just like we planned." But Eric wasn't done. The fear in his eyes had shifted back to anger, the anger of someone who just realized that his carefully planned exit strategy had some unexpected complications. "You can't use the kids as weapons, Lily," he said, standing up and pacing toward the window. "Whatever problems you have with me, Lily and Jake don't deserve to be caught in the middle of it." The irony of that statement was breathtaking. The man who just served me divorce papers on Christmas morning, in front of our 4-year-old children, was accusing me of using them as weapons. The man who'd spent years treating parenthood as an inconvenience was suddenly concerned about their emotional well-being. "You're absolutely right," I said, standing up as well and moving protectively closer to the twins. "They don't deserve to be caught in the middle. They deserve parents who show up for them, who prioritize them, who understand that being a father is more than just a legal designation on paperwork." "I've been a good father," Eric said, but even he seemed to know how unconvincing that sounded. "Have you?" I asked quietly. "When was the last time you read them a bedtime story without being asked? When did you last attend one of Lily's piano lessons or help Jake with his reading homework? When did you last plan an activity around their interests instead of your schedule?" Eric opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, because the answers to those questions would only prove my point. He couldn't remember the last time he'd initiated meaningful interaction with his children, because it had been months, even longer.
"That's not fair," he said finally. "I work hard to provide for this family. I can't be everything to everyone." "No one's asking you to be everything," I replied, "but being their father requires more than financial contribution. It requires emotional investment, daily presence, caring about their inner lives and experiences. It requires choosing them over work sometimes, showing up for their important moments, making them feel valued and loved." Jake had been listening to this entire exchange with his characteristic focus, and suddenly he spoke up, his small voice cutting through the adult tension with devastating clarity. "Daddy, are you not going to live with us anymore?" The question hung in the air like a weight. Eric looked at his son, this brilliant, sensitive little boy who'd inherited academic ability and determination from carefully selected genetics, who'd been trying for 4 years to earn his father's attention and approval.
Jake's face was serious, not crying, but clearly trying to understand the magnitude of what was happening to his family. Eric started, then stopped, apparently realizing that there was no way to explain his decision that wouldn't hurt his children or make him look selfish. Sometimes grown-ups need to live in different places, but that doesn't mean I don't love you and Lily. But why? Jake persisted, with the logical persistence that was one of his most endearing qualities. Did we do something wrong? Are you mad at us? No, buddy, you didn't do anything wrong, Eric said, his voice softer now, perhaps finally grasping that his children were real people with real feelings about his decision to leave them. This is about Mommy and Daddy, not about you. But that wasn't entirely true, was it? Eric's decision to divorce me was absolutely about his unwillingness to be the kind of husband and father our family needed. His desire for freedom was directly related to his perception of parenthood as a burden rather than a joy. Lily and Jake weren't the cause of our marriage's failure, but they were certainly part of what Eric was trying to escape. Lily, who'd been quietly processing everything with her inherited sensitivity and intelligence, suddenly stepped forward and looked directly at her father. "If you don't want to live with us," she said with devastating 4-year-old logic, "then you don't have to. Mommy takes care of us anyway." The simple truth of that statement hit Eric like a physical blow. Because Lily was right. I did take care of them. I managed their schedules, their medical appointments, their school events, their emotional needs, their daily care. Eric's departure wouldn't change their actual lived experience very much because he'd never been fully present for it anyway. "Lily, that's not," Eric began, but he couldn't finish the sentence because there was no way to deny what she'd said without lying. I watched my husband's face as he confronted the reality of his own irrelevance in his children's daily lives. Not because I'd excluded him, but because he'd excluded himself, through years of choosing work over family, convenience over connection, his own priorities over theirs. The legal documents were still spread across our coffee table, next to the wrapped Christmas presents that Lily and Jake had been so excited to open. The contrast was surreal and heartbreaking. Their childhood innocence and joy sitting next to the legal framework that would reshape their family forever. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice calm but firm. "The children are going to open their Christmas presents and have a wonderful morning, because they deserve that regardless of what's happening between us. Then, after they're occupied with their new toys, you and I are going to discuss the practical implications of these papers you've brought me." Eric nodded, seeming relieved to postpone the harder conversation, but I wasn't done. "And during that discussion, you're going to understand exactly what your relationship to Lily and Jake will look like going forward. Because if you think you can walk away from this family without consequences, if you think you can treat parenthood like a part-time hobby you can abandon when it becomes inconvenient, you're about to learn how wrong you are." The gift opening that followed was surreal in its forced normalcy. Lily and Jake, resilient in the way children have to be, threw themselves into Christmas morning with determined enthusiasm. They exclaimed over their new art supplies and books. They hugged me tightly for remembering exactly what they'd hoped for. They even politely thanked Eric for presents he'd had minimal involvement in choosing or wrapping. Eric went through the motions of Christmas morning participation, making appropriate sounds of surprise and delight, taking photos when I reminded him, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. He was distracted by the legal documents, by the implications of what I'd revealed, by the dawning understanding that his exit strategy had some serious complications he hadn't anticipated. The children, attuned to their parents' emotional states in the way children always are, adapted their expectations accordingly. They brought their new books to me to read, showed me their artwork, included Eric politely, but didn't expect real engagement from him. It was a heartbreaking demonstration of how they'd already learned to navigate their father's emotional unavailability. After an hour of present opening and the breakfast I'd prepared the night before, Lily and Jake settled into their playroom with their new toys, giving Eric and me the privacy we needed for the conversation that would determine our family's future. "Okay," Eric said, settling back onto the couch and picking up the legal documents again. "Explain this to me. What exactly are you threatening?" "I'm not threatening anything," I said, pouring myself another cup of coffee and settling into the chair across from him. "I'm explaining reality. The reality of your legal relationship to our children, the reality of your minimal involvement in their lives, and the reality of what divorce will mean for all of us." Eric flipped through the donor selection paperwork again, his face showing a mixture of confusion and growing concern. "So you're saying I'm not really their father? That's ridiculous. I'm on their birth certificates. I've been supporting them their whole lives." "You're their legal father," I clarified, "because you were married to me when they were conceived and because you consented to the IVF process. But you have no biological connection to them whatsoever. The sperm that created Lily and Jake came from donor 3291, whose genetics I selected based on extensive research while you were busy checking your watch and complaining about being late for work." The reminder of his attitude during the donor selection process clearly stung. Eric had been so dismissive, so impatient with the entire process, treating the choice of genetic material for our children like an inconvenience that was keeping him from more important things. "But legally, I'm still their father," he insisted. "A divorce doesn't change that." "Actually, it can," I said, reaching for the legal memo at the bottom of the folder. "In cases involving assisted reproduction where one parent has no biological connection to the children, parental rights can be modified or terminated if that parent demonstrates abandonment or unwillingness to fulfill parental responsibilities." Eric read through the memo slowly, his expression growing more troubled with each paragraph. The legal precedents were clear. Non-biological parents in IVF cases had walked away from their children with minimal ongoing responsibility, but they'd also had their rights terminated when their ex-spouses could demonstrate that they'd essentially abandoned their parental duties. "You've documented everything," he said, flipping through pages of carefully recorded missed events, absent interactions, and instances of him choosing work or personal interests over family time. "I've documented your choices," I corrected. "Your priorities, your level of engagement, your approach to fatherhood. If you see that as building a case against you, maybe that tells you something about the kind of parent you've been." Eric was quiet for a long time, reading through the documentation of his own absence. Baseball games he'd missed, school conferences he'd skipped, bedtime stories he'd been too tired to read, family activities he'd found excuses to avoid. The pattern was undeniable and damning. "So what do you want?" he asked finally. "What's your endgame here?" "I want honesty," I said simply. "If you want out of this marriage, if you've decided that being a husband and father is too restricting for the life you want to live, then be honest about it. But understand what you're walking away from and what your obligations will be." "And if I decide I want shared custody? If I want to maintain my relationship with the kids?" I looked toward the playroom, where Lily and Jake were happily absorbed in their new toys, their Christmas morning joy finally restored after the earlier tension. They deserved so much better than a father who saw them as obligations rather than gifts. "Then you'll need to demonstrate that you're actually capable of being their father, not just showing up for court-ordered visitation, but being present for their daily lives, their emotional needs, their growth and development. You'll need to prove that you can prioritize them sometimes over work, that you can engage with their interests and activities, that you can provide the kind of stable, loving environment they deserve." Eric laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're setting me up to fail. You've already decided I'm a terrible father, so nothing I do will be good enough." "I haven't decided anything," I replied. Your actions over the past 4 years have demonstrated exactly what kind of father you are. If you want to change that, if you want to become the kind of parent Lily and Jake deserve, then start changing it. But don't expect me to pretend that your minimal involvement has been adequate just because it's convenient for your divorce plans. The truth was, I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted from this conversation. Part of me hoped that confronting Eric with the reality of his absence would shock him into becoming a better father. Part of me thought that maybe complete honesty about our situation would help us find a way to co-parent effectively, even if our marriage was over. But a larger part of me suspected that Eric would ultimately choose the path of least resistance, which would be walking away from his parental responsibilities, just as he was walking away from our marriage. And if that happened, I wanted to make sure Lily and Jake were protected, both legally and emotionally. The donor information, Eric returned to the paperwork with a different focus. You're saying the kids got their abilities from this guy? Their intelligence, Lily's music thing, Jake's reading?
Their genetic potential came from donor 3291, I confirmed. The donor I selected after weeks of research into family history, medical background, educational achievement, and personal characteristics. The children are developing exactly the kinds of abilities and interests that his profile suggested they might inherit. Eric studied the donor's information more carefully than he'd ever studied it during our original selection process. The donor's master's degree in literature, his musical background, his family history of academic achievement and physical coordination, the personal statement about wanting to help couples build families and understanding that genetics were just the beginning of what made someone a parent. "He sounds like a better father than me," Eric said quietly. And for the first time in our conversation, I heard something that might have been genuine regret. "He's not their father," I said firmly. "You are, legally and socially. But fatherhood isn't about genetics, Eric. It's about showing up, being present, choosing your children's needs over your own comfort sometimes. It's about loving them enough to prioritize their well-being and emotional security." "I do love them," Eric said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I believe you think you do," I replied. "But love isn't just a feeling. It's a series of choices, actions, priorities. Love is reading bedtime stories when you're tired, attending school events when you'd rather be somewhere else, learning about their interests even when they don't interest you." Eric was quiet again, and I could see him struggling with the gap between his self-perception as a loving father and the documented reality of his minimal engagement with his children's lives. From the playroom came the sound of Lily playing a simple melody on the small keyboard Santa had brought her, her natural musical ability evident even in her careful 4-year-old practice. Jake was reading aloud to his stuffed animals, showing off the advanced reading skills that had amazed his teachers. "They're incredible kids," I said, listening to their voices blend in happy Christmas morning activity. "They're smart, talented, kind, resilient. They deserve a father who sees those qualities and wants to nurture them, who feels proud and amazed by who they're becoming." "I am proud of them," Eric protested. "When was the last time you told them that? When did you last spend time with Lily learning about her musical interests or help Jake pick out new books? When did you last plan an activity around what they enjoy rather than what's convenient for your schedule?" Eric couldn't answer those questions because the honest answers would only reinforce my point. He'd been a passive observer of his children's development rather than an active participant in it. "Look," he said finally, setting the papers aside and leaning forward, "maybe I haven't been the most engaged father. Maybe I've prioritized work too much, missed some things I shouldn't have missed, but that doesn't mean I want to abandon them. That doesn't mean I don't care about their futures." "Then prove it," I said simply. "Not in court, not in legal documents, but in daily life. Show up for them. Be present for their experiences. Learn their favorite books, their friends' names, their fears and dreams and daily struggles. Choose them over work sometimes. Make them feel like they matter to you. And if I do, if I become the kind of father you think they deserve?" I considered that question carefully, because the truth was our marriage had problems that went beyond Eric's parenting failures. His emotional unavailability affected our relationship as much as it affected his relationship with the children.
His inability to prioritize family over work had created resentment and loneliness that wouldn't disappear just because he started reading more bedtime stories.
Then we'll figure out how to co-parent effectively, I said. Whether we stay married or get divorced, Lily and Jake deserve parents who can work together for their benefit. But Eric, I won't pretend that your minimal involvement has been adequate, and I won't agree to custody arrangements that don't serve their best interests. Eric picked up his phone, checking messages out of habit, then seemed to realize what he was doing and put it away. Even in the middle of the most important conversation about our family's future, his instinct was to check work email. "The legal stuff?" he said, gesturing toward the documents. "About my rights, about the donor genetics. You're saying I could lose access to them completely?" "I'm saying that parental rights come with parental responsibilities," I replied. "If you want to maintain your legal relationship with Lily and Jake, you need to demonstrate that you're fulfilling your role as their father. And if you decide that parenthood is too much work or too restricting for the life you want to live, then yes, those rights can be modified." The reality was more complex than I was making it sound. Family courts generally favored maintaining relationships between children and both parents whenever possible. But Eric's documented pattern of minimal engagement, combined with his lack of biological connection to the twins, would give me significant leverage in custody negotiations. More importantly, I had evidence that Eric had essentially checked out of active parenting long before he'd decided to end our marriage. The children's daily routines, emotional support, and care wouldn't change significantly if he disappeared from their lives entirely. In some ways, they might be better off without the constant disappointment of a father who promised presence but delivered absence. "I need to think about this," Eric said, gathering the legal documents into a neat pile. "I need to understand what I'm really deciding between." "Take all the time you need," I said, though I knew that time wouldn't change the fundamental choice he was facing. Either he wanted to be a real father to Lily and Jake with all the sacrifice and commitment that required, or he wanted the freedom to live his life without the daily responsibilities of parenthood. From the playroom came a crash, followed by Lily's voice calling, "It's okay, we're okay." The kind of minor disaster that happens when children are playing enthusiastically with new toys. Eric didn't even look up from his phone, which he'd pulled out again despite putting it away moments before. I got up to check on them, finding Jake trying to help Lily rebuild a tower of blocks that had toppled over. They were working together with the kind of patient cooperation that reminded me constantly of how well they'd learned to rely on each other rather than expecting help from their father. "Need any assistance?" I asked, kneeling down next to their project. "We've got it, Mommy," Lily said with 4-year-old confidence. "Jake knows how to make it stronger this time." I watched them work together, their heads bent over the colorful blocks, Lily's musical hands surprisingly skilled at construction, Jake's academic mind already figuring out principles of balance and stability. They were remarkable children, thriving despite their father's emotional absence, developing into compassionate, intelligent, resilient little people. When I returned to the living room, Eric was scrolling through his phone again, apparently unable to sit with the weight of our conversation without digital distraction. "The kids are fine," I said, settling back into my chair. "They're building something together. They're good at working as a team." Eric looked up briefly, then back at his phone. Even when I was explicitly telling him about his children's activities, his attention was elsewhere.
"Eric," I said quietly, "do you see what just happened? I told you about Lily and Jake working together, about their cooperation and problem solving, and you barely looked up from your phone. Even now, even in the middle of deciding whether you want to be their father, you can't focus on them for 30 seconds? He put the phone down, his face flushing slightly with embarrassment or annoyance. "I heard you. They're building blocks. They're fine." "They're more than fine," I said. "They're developing remarkable skills, showing emotional intelligence and creativity and resilience,
but you wouldn't know that because you're not paying attention to who they're becoming." Eric was quiet for a moment, and I could see him trying to process the criticism, trying to decide whether to defend himself or acknowledge the truth of what I was saying. "Maybe I'm not the most attentive father," he said finally. "Maybe I get distracted by work too easily. But that doesn't mean I don't care about them." "Caring about them and being present for them are two different things," I replied. "Lily and Jake need more than your abstract care. They need your attention, your engagement, your active participation in their lives." The morning was wearing on, and I could hear the twins getting hungrier and more energetic in the playroom. Soon they'd need lunch and afternoon activities, and all the normal rhythms of family life that Eric had always left to me to manage. "What if we tried counseling?" Eric asked suddenly. "What if we worked on this together, tried to save the marriage and figure out how to be better parents?" The suggestion surprised me, not because it was unreasonable, but because it was the first time Eric had proposed working on our problems rather than walking away from them. "Are you asking because you want to save our marriage, or because you're realizing that divorce might be more complicated than you planned?" I asked. Eric was quiet for a long time, considering the question. When he finally answered, his honesty was both painful and clarifying. "Both," he said. "I thought ending the marriage would be straightforward. I thought I could maintain my relationship with the kids without all the daily complications of family life. But you're right that I haven't been present for them the way I should have been. And maybe I don't know how to be present." It was the most honest thing Eric had said in months, maybe years. An admission that he'd checked out of our family life without really understanding what he was giving up or how to re-engage with it. "Learning how to be present isn't complicated," I said gently. "It just requires choosing them over other things sometimes, choosing their needs over your convenience, their emotional security over your work priorities, their experiences over your preferences." Eric nodded slowly, but I could see the uncertainty in his face. The idea of restructuring his priorities around family life clearly felt overwhelming to him, which told me everything about how far apart our values had grown. Lily appeared in the doorway, her face bright with Christmas morning joy despite the earlier tension. "Mommy, can we make hot chocolate with the marshmallows?" she asked, then looked at Eric with polite inclusion. "Daddy, do you want hot chocolate too?" The question was casual, natural, but it highlighted the dynamic that had developed in our family. Lily automatically asked me for permission and planning, then included Eric as an afterthought, not expecting him to be involved in the actual process of making hot chocolate or cleaning up afterward. "That sounds perfect, sweetheart," I said, standing up to follow her to the kitchen. "We can make it extra special with whipped cream, too."
Eric remained on the couch, surrounded by legal documents and divorce papers, checking his phone again while his daughter invited him to participate in a simple Christmas morning tradition. The contrast between what she was offering and what he was choosing couldn't have been clearer. As I helped Lily and Jake make hot chocolate, measuring marshmallows and whipped cream with the kind of careful precision they loved, I realized that our conversation had clarified something important for me. Eric's offer to try counseling wasn't motivated by a desire to become a better husband and father. It was motivated by a desire to avoid the legal and financial complications of divorce, while maintaining his current level of minimal engagement with family life. He didn't want to change his priorities or his approach to parenthood. He wanted to find a way to keep his options open while avoiding accountability for his choices. And that wasn't fair to Lily and Jake, who deserved parents who chose them wholeheartedly rather than grudgingly. When we returned to the living room with our hot chocolate, Eric was reading through the divorce papers he'd brought, his expression thoughtful but not necessarily remorseful. "I think I understand now," he said, looking up as the children settled on the floor with their mugs. "This isn't just about custody or legal rights.
You're telling me that if I want to be their father, I have to actually be their father." "Yes," I said simply. "Fatherhood isn't a title you hold, it's a role you fulfill through daily choices and consistent presence and emotional investment." Eric watched Lily and Jake enjoying their hot chocolate, their faces sticky with marshmallows, their Christmas morning contentment restored. For a moment, I thought I saw something shift in his expression, a flicker of recognition about what he might be losing. "If I decide I want to try," he said quietly, "if I want to learn how to be present for them the way you're describing, what would that look like?" It was a fair question, and one that deserved a thoughtful answer, because despite everything, despite years of disappointment and resentment, I still wanted Lily and Jake to have a father who loved them actively rather than passively. It would mean putting your phone away when they're trying to talk to you. It would mean reading bedtime stories, even when you're tired. It would mean attending their school events, learning about their interests, planning activities around what they enjoy. It would mean choosing them over work sometimes, even when that's inconvenient. "And our marriage?" Eric asked. "If I became the kind of father you think they deserve, would you be willing to work on us, too?" It was the question I'd been dreading, because the honest answer was complicated and painful. Eric's failures as a father were symptoms of deeper issues in his character and priorities. His inability to be present for his children reflected his inability to be truly present for anyone other than himself. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Being a better father would be a start, but our marriage has problems that go beyond your parenting. Your emotional unavailability, your inability to prioritize family over work, your tendency to check out when things get difficult. Those patterns affect every aspect of our relationship." Eric nodded slowly, apparently understanding that there were no simple solutions to the complex web of problems we'd created over years of growing apart.
Lily had finished her hot chocolate and was curled up against my side, her small body warm and trusting. Jake was sitting on the floor, reading one of his new books aloud to himself, his voice confident and clear. They were perfect, complicated little people who deserved so much more than parents who stayed together out of obligation or fear of legal complications. "I need time to think," Eric said finally, gathering his papers and standing up, "about what I really want, about what I'm capable of changing, about what's best for all of us." "Take all the time you need," I said, though I suspected that time wouldn't fundamentally change who Eric was or what he was willing to sacrifice for his family. As Eric headed upstairs, presumably to make phone calls or send emails or find some other way to avoid sitting with the weight of his choices, Lily looked up at me with her inherited wisdom and sensitivity. "Mommy, is Daddy going to live somewhere else?" The question deserved an honest answer, one that acknowledged her intelligence while protecting her emotional security. "I don't know yet, sweetheart," I said, smoothing her hair. "Daddy needs to decide some important things about our family, but no matter what happens, you and Jake are loved and safe and cared for. That will never change." Lily nodded solemnly, then brightened as she remembered something important. "Can we watch the Christmas movie now, the one with the singing?" "Absolutely," I said, reaching for the remote and settling deeper into the couch with my children. "That sounds like the perfect way to spend Christmas afternoon." As the opening credits rolled and Lily and Jake snuggled closer, I realized that whatever Eric decided about our marriage and his role in our family, we would be okay. The children and I had built a life together that wasn't dependent on his presence or approval. We'd created routines, traditions, and emotional security that existed independently of his participation. If Eric chose to become a real father and partner, we could potentially rebuild our family on a stronger foundation. If he chose his own freedom over our needs, we'd continue thriving without him.
Either way, Lily and Jake would grow up knowing they were loved, valued, and prioritized by at least one parent who understood that family was worth sacrificing for. The Christmas story that had begun with divorce papers and legal documents was ending with hot chocolate and holiday movies, and children secure in their mother's love. Not the ending Eric had planned, perhaps, but the ending Lily and Jake deserved. And sometimes that's the only gift that really matters.